Hi, Dawn. Thank you so much for coming on the Speak as a Leader podcast. I was especially excited about this conversation because you were introduced to me by our good friend, Lynn Wong, who I interviewed for an earlier episode. And not just that, but you're in New York and you've been in New York for a very long time. And as I was telling you earlier, it's a city very, very close to my heart. So I take every opportunity to talk to New Yorkers and revisit a part of my past that I was so attached to. So welcome to the show. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us.
Yeah, great. I'm excited to be here. I love this topic actually, so really looking forward to sharing some time. And I'm sure Lynn is listening. And thanks to Lynn for introducing and connecting us, so we could be doing this here.
Thank you, Lynn. You're awesome. So let's dive right in.
Sure.
When I say yes, so when I say the words, speak as a leader, what comes to mind?
Well, I mean, what's top of mind for me is when you say that is that as a leader, I think we have to be mindful that that's our role at an organization. So you have to be mindful of the impact that what you're saying, and when you're in these leadership roles, it might be viewed a bit differently by your audience than, let's say, somebody who isn't in the same type of leadership role. So you just have to be really conscious and aware and present of how your audience might be perceiving your message. And, you know, I think that sometimes people aren't always aware of their environment. And I'll give you a for instance when I think about this. But recently I've become more aware of how like a male might communicate. And one of the things that has been told to me is like, you know, these male leaders, they use a lot of sports metaphors. And me as a woman, I don't even know what you're talking about when you start talking about like inside baseball or I don't know, whatever your Monday morning quarterback or these sort of things. And I think we have a responsibility as a leader just to have this audience awareness of like, are we saying things that might alienate part of our audience and that people can't relate to? That if I'm going to speak as a leader, I have a responsibility to understand that there's something in the messaging which I might have grown up with or might feel familiar with my friends or something that just doesn't work when you're speaking as a leader. So I think it's just giving some thought and being conscious to say that your role, you have a responsibility to do that. I mean, me personally, I take that very seriously. And I think that we're making progress in this space, but I think it's something that from a messaging standpoint, it's helpful to share that with people because I think some people aren't always thinking about this, and they just say like, "This is my role. I can stand up. It's just a one-way communication," and I leave, and I don't even ask for feedback.
I love that. That's really challenging those traditional notions that we have of leadership, perhaps those outdated notions that we may have grown up with over the past few decades, that being a leader is this, basically being on this platform and people listening to you and you being self-important and just like you said, having this one-way conversation, like my job is to deliver my vision and impart this wisdom and show the way. And none of that is true anymore. And I am hopeful that I'm right when I'm saying this, that if there are leaders like that, they are going to be dinosaurs very soon, if they aren't already, which is a very happy thought in my head.
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, my perspective on this is that there's a lot of work to be done here. I don't know when we can declare victory there. But I think just by talking about it, it should help extend the reach to some people. And hopefully at least one person listening to this is going to say like, wow, I didn't really think about that. Maybe I have a responsibility to do that as I go forward.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the hope. One of the reasons why I was really excited to talk to you is because you are this fresh, innovative voice in a traditional industry. So I would love for us to go a little bit back and go a little deeper and talk about your past, a little bit about your journey and what got you here.
Sure. Well, I've been in the, let's say, ocean container shipping industry now, I guess 26-ish years or so. So it's been a while. And my journey, which I think is an important point, I started as a customer service person at the container shipping line Hapag-Lloyd, and basically I was an order taker. I was taking bookings, and this was a job which, first of all, technology was much different back then. We're talking 1994 when this, well, really 1995, but anyway, who's counting? But it was a while ago when this started, and we're still using things like clipboards, and we're like writing things down because you didn't have a way to input into the system. Somebody had to manually do it because it was a different system, et cetera. But it was a long time ago, and that was my first position. And I would say this industry has been typically a male-dominated industry. So you didn't see very many women in the industry. You certainly didn't see women in leadership roles. And you had like people that had been with the company a long time, mostly in a leadership role. And from there, I moved into a sales capacity, and I was covering the Midwest because I lived in Chicago at the time. That's where I was born and raised. And then I moved through some different roles as a manager. So I finally got my own team. And I remember what that was like because I was so excited to be a manager. Like I always wanted to be a manager. I always wanted to manage people. And then I started managing people. I'm like, ooh, this is not as easy as I thought, actually. It's somehow easier to manage myself because I know what I'm going to do. Maybe I have the self-discipline, but my group did not perform the same way I wanted to. So I started to get humbled about how challenging it is to be a good manager. And then at some point I moved to Detroit, Michigan. So in 1999, I moved to Detroit. And then 2001, I moved back to Chicago because what was happening is there was some consolidation of functions, very driven by cost savings. So the team I was out in Detroit to manage, it was a team of 12. They were quickly a team of 2 when I didn't need an office there. I didn't really need to be there. So then I moved back to Chicago. Enjoyed my time in Detroit, by the way, a very lovely place. A lot of great things to explore in Detroit. But then I moved back. And then shortly thereafter, I became a global account director was the role. So I was managing the automotive segment. So I dealt with Ford, GM, and Chrysler. And then from there, I was the sales director. So I managed all the commercial activity within a 22-state area. It was considered the Northeast, so it was Midwest and East Coast. And that was really my first experience in New York, New Jersey. And then in 2012, the company called me and said, hey, we got a great opportunity for you. We want you to run this U.S. flag division. So we had a group that supported the military because there's bases scattered all over the world and they need their supplies and, peanut butter and things you can't get when you live in Europe. So they sent me to Antwerp, Belgium, and I lived in Antwerp for about 3 years from 2012 to 2015 as basically the head of Europe, Middle East, and Africa for the U.S. flag division based in Antwerp, Belgium. Got to go to some really good places, Bahrain, spent some time there and throughout Italy, Europe. Anyway, great position. Loved being in Europe. And then I moved back to the U.S. in 2015. There I was a senior vice president of sales and customer service. I did that job for 3 years. And that was more of a strategic role. And actually, one of the coolest things we did is some massive change management. We worked with McKinsey to implement a new sales strategy, which, again, change is hard. And that's like the underlying message that happened there is that change just doesn't come naturally to everyone. And how do you implement change? And that was very healthy for me. And then in 2018, I took a position at CMA CGM. So I went from a German carrier to a French carrier. And I was the vice president of their strategic sales, looking after their MDO segment. And I did that for about a year and a half before I joined this New York Shipping Exchange. So now I work at a startup in New York City. I've been doing this for 2.5 years, and now I'm the senior vice president of what we call NVO Experience. And that's just me managing a vertical with about a team scattered across the US and Europe as well. So so it's been a great journey. Done a lot of different things, and It wasn't always the way I thought I would go, but I wouldn't change a thing because sometimes things you don't choose for yourself are healthy for you, and I've learned a lot along the way.
Thank you for taking us through that. That really was a very, very interesting and very rich journey. And of course, the first question that comes to mind is, what made you stick with the same industry? That's from your very first job to now. You haven't left the industry.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's crazy, right? But I think for me, I think the industry was like fascinating for me. I really didn't know anything about ocean shipping until I started on the carrier side. Um, when I was in college, I was an international business major. So I thought I was going to work at like McDonald's because they're based in Oak Brook, Illinois, or Abbott Labs or somewhere, and like running their international division, or I thought I was going to be an ambassador, U.S. ambassador, stationed in France or something. And none of those things happened, but this ocean carrier position opened up. And I'm like, well, what is this all about? And then I started taking orders for like Archer Daniels Midland, Pioneer Hybrid, Caterpillar, Ford Motor Company. And I'm like, wow, you really touch a lot of different industries. And then you start to learn a little bit more about supply chain. And then you start to learn a little bit more about how a government can affect shipping and how weather can affect shipping. And so it was always very interesting to me. And I would say 2 to 3 years, I was changing jobs, either through a promotion or more responsibility. So I kept moving along. And it was always very exciting for me. I had a lot of opportunities and I was very lucky that way. Some of the positions I took, I was told like, you have to take this position. So I didn't always like want to do that, but I'm like, okay, if you tell me that and it helps my career, I would do it. And that was actually very helpful. And I would say everything I went through was always, like I said, I always felt like I was growing as a person. I felt like I was learning. I felt like the
Mm-hmm.
company was giving me opportunities. And I I have no complaints, but it's I know it's funny to be like, wow, why did you stay in this industry for so long? But really everything I've done has really been really cool. In the 90s, I started really traveling. I went on my first business trip to Tokyo, Japan, which was
Mm-hmm.
wild because it was just so foreign to me. I mean, that's I think pretty intense first trip, at least for me it was. And then I started traveling to Europe. I was on a number of projects. I helped design their quotation system, their contract management system. So anyway, I was just involved in a lot of different things, and I found it very fulfilling. I felt like I was growing as a person, and I was given a lot of opportunity. So I stuck with it, and here I am, 2023, still part of the shipping industry, and I still love it.
It's fascinating because if we were sitting in the 90s or even maybe in the early 2000s, that wouldn't have been a question because it was pretty much the norm back then. I think one of my boss's bosses, when I was at Procter and Gamble, he had come into P&G and it was as his first job, and he would eventually retire maybe 25 years later, and that was pretty normal. When I got into the corporate world back in 2006, that was still fairly normal to hear. Like, oh, this person actually came in as an intern. Now they're retiring as a director. And that was a success story. And no one batted an eyelid and thought, why did this person stick around for so long? It was more a badge of honor. I do think that times have changed, and in a good and a bad way. I would say that change changing things up, changing jobs up is more normal now than it was before. Because earlier, you probably remember this, it would be something to actually have to explain on a CV if you change jobs too quickly. It would be a sign of, oh, this person isn't reliable, they're not loyal, we can't count on them, they're too fickle. And I think and hope that that has changed now, and someone can easily explain, like, look, I was in this role, this wasn't a good fit for me, the culture wasn't great, I just needed to leave, so I left in 3 months, and that's that, and that's an answer that would be acceptable in a job interview. So I find that fascinating how times change, and it's great because you've seen trends and times change over the years especially in your industry, in the shipping industry?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the industry, it's a pretty old industry. And I think when you say old, it's one that is very traditional, hasn't gone through a lot of change. Technology has been very limited. And I think when people think of the industry, that's the things that are top of mind. I think it has changed. It started to change. But also this idea that, you stay in one place for a long time. And if you didn't, it was bad. I think it's like now the reverse of that. Like if you've been at one place for a long time, companies may not want you because they're like, well, I don't think you're going to handle the change of being somewhere else. And, I think, people shouldn't necessarily be judged by one or the other. I think you have to look at the merits of the person and just talk to them and have a conversation and assess them that way. Don't just say, well, you're here, this place, or you moved around, because I think in either case, it can be valuable. Like if you're in one place for a long time, but you're trying different things, you're managing different functions, it can sometimes feel like a different job. I mean, I think I can think of times where I was in the same job and I had a different boss and it felt like a different job. So like there's things that can affect you in a way where you're maybe getting something out of it. It's changing your perspective. And the question for me is, are you learning? Are you evolving as a person? Because I think there's an assumption today that if you stay in one place for a long time, you're not really evolving and growing. And I don't know that
Yeah.
that's true. I mean, you're definitely changing if you're changing companies, but then you could say like, well, you're never satisfied, or am I only going to get 2 years? And who knows the answer to these questions? So I think everyone's going to have their own story, and I think either can work for me.
Yeah, I think what you pointed towards, that hopefully we're moving in a direction where we're judging things less by our own preconceived notions and biases, that will eventually lead to us just looking at everything on a case by case basis and being intentional about leaving behind the biases that we've accumulated over time. And I don't think it was the case again back in the 80s or the 90s or even the early 2000s. I don't think people were as aware of their biases in the work environment or just in general. So I think that is a great direction to take. I remember in your first response, you actually hinted towards something which is something I ask everyone on the show. So one of the quintessential questions that I ask is, did you have a flip switch moment where you realized that you were no longer just an employee or just a manager? You had become a leader. And I remember you pointed towards this, you hinted at this in your first response when you said you very quickly realized that, oh my God, I'm a manager now. And I'm not just responsible for myself. I'm responsible for the results that my team delivers. So can you tell me a little about that? Did you have a specific moment where you had this realization?
Absolutely. And I remember it vividly because it's when I first started in a role as a sales director. And what had happened is that some people, I consider myself a people person. I came from customer service background, so I'm just a coordinator. And I came up through the ranks in these roles, and I always consider myself that I wasn't a special person. I'm just a regular person with a certain amount of responsibility. And, I'm not like royalty or something that you can't like talk to me like a person. And, what started to happen is that there were people that didn't want to talk to me anymore, that I had relationships with, that I had known. But once I became a director, they were less interested to talk to me on a social or personal level. And they're more like, oh no, you're the management. I can't really express myself in the same way, because I felt like you were more a peer when you're a manager, but now that you're a director, you're part of them. And I was like, wow, this is really something, right? That like, I can't have these candid conversations, but I'm still the same person as, I was before, but now my role has changed and I'm being looked at differently, and that you can't talk to me in the same way. You can't just necessarily be as honest and say like, oh, I didn't like this meeting we had the other day or something. And so you might feel like there's a repercussion there. But it was really important for me because then I started to realize like, wow, my messaging might have to be different too, that I have to be really thoughtful because, there's this different level of expectation from, even though I feel like I'm the same, I'm still the person. It's Don Davis. I've been the same, relatively the same, even though I'm growing and evolving. But I have this awareness now that I'm not being perceived the same way. People aren't reacting to me in this, interacting with me in the same way. And so, what are the thoughts I should have, and how should I be more mindful that this has happened? Versus like something I tried to drive myself. And I didn't say like, haha, I'm a director now and you have to obey. I always thought I was going to be like this regular friendly guy and that I could just talk to people and like, no, this change is happening whether I want it or not. When you took this position, you probably signed up for it. And it was really just an, oh, wow, aha, flip switch moment for me that I had to be more mindful of like, wow, things are different. And it's important that I recognize this versus just trying to fight it. It shouldn't be that alien to me that people start to behave in this way.
So did you then reassert the personality that you always wanted to have, that no, I'm still approachable, this is still me, Dawn, or did you step into a different kind of persona?
Well, I mean, I've always tried to be an approachable person, have an open door policy. I've tried to be helpful. I mean, I think there's other things that you can do to convey to people. For example, you could be a listener because sometimes there's a time to talk and sometimes there's a time to listen. And if you come to me with a problem, but I'm the only one who's talking, I'm probably not helping you through that problem. So I think there's different things you could do to try and make people feel more welcomed. Because I think a lot of times, leaders are, it might be top down. It might be that they're too dominant in a conversation that they don't feel like they're getting something out of it. And I think those types of interactions make people maybe more cautious when they deal with leaders. So how can you invite people in? So it just made me more aware that like I have to be more thoughtful around how I interact with people and make them feel more comfortable, because I can't just think it like, oh, I'm a regular guy, I'm nice and, I'll just be friendly and say hi to people and they're going to feel like I'm welcoming and they can talk to me. Well, no, it's actual effort. And you have to think about how important those interactions you have with people, whatever that touch point is, and be thoughtful of like, is this person going to walk away and feel like, wow, that was really great. I feel like, they expressed empathy or they expressed that they, are willing to listen, or, they didn't really say very much other than like, hey, I'm really glad to share that. Thank you. And we're going to look at that. Like, what was the interaction like? And, you can't always do that. I mean, sometimes as a leader, you have to say like, look, we're implementing this and, we're all stuck with this idea, whether we like it or not, we have to execute this, what we have to do. And I think, sharing that honest perspective versus like, it's me, the director, obey, do what I say. Like that never really worked for me. And, I tried to really be thoughtful on like, what did other leaders do that I didn't like? Okay, I don't want to be that for somebody else. What are the things that resonated with me and made me really want to work with this person? Then how do I invoke some of those traits so that people can have that interaction with me? And I'd like to think I was largely successful. You'd have to ask other people whether or not they think I was or I wasn't, because, I'm hopelessly biased. But I think just being aware and trying to think through that is part of the battle there.
I love that you're so self-aware and that you made this effort to not just rely on your natural charm and friendliness that you just had as a regular person, but you made an effort to figure out what parts of your personality to intentionally show in different situations, to intentionally amplify in different situations, to be able to lead better. And it really reminds me of definitely all the classic mistakes I made when I was a leader and a people manager, because I think I made every single mistake in the book for sure. And there's this one picture that I keep looking at, and I write about it a lot. It was a day where we had some filming in the office. I was a filmmaker for 7 years. So I led a small team, a video production team, where we created commercials for clients. And a lot of times we would just do our own filming, just showing how we work, and made little vlogs and put them on YouTube. So it was a day where we had one of our team members filming the whole day. And I took a screen grab from one of the videos that he was taking of me working with my producer on a project, and we were looking it over and discussing feedback. And in the entire interaction, my team member was sitting next to me. We were looking at the same computer, and I was sitting like this. So for those of us listening, I had my head in my hand, looking defeated, and I looked like you could read my expression. It was, oh my God, I'm so tired. Can we just get it over with? And every time I look at that picture, I wonder, what did my team member think? I was the boss in that scenario, and that was the vibe I was giving. I was not being intentional at all. I was not thinking about her, the fact that I always need to be the person who brings the right energy to the conversation, who sets the right tone. I was just exhausted, close to being burnt out, and I was showing it. And I wasn't even aware of how my energy would rub off on someone else, just things that a leader should not be doing. So that really resonates with me, what you said, that you're the one who has to set the tone. You're the one who has to listen more. You're the one who has to be more flexible if you're in a leading role.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think maybe what helped my perspective is that, I mentioned like I went from, having allies amongst the population, and we would just talk openly about things. And I would get feedback about other leaders and things people didn't like about them. For example, they weren't listening. For example, I brought you a problem and I left with more work than I came in your office with. Like, I needed your help to solve something, and you just gave me a bunch of tasks to do. So there are things that I had heard that other leaders were doing that would just frustrate people. And so I became aware, like, oh yeah, that's terrible. And then at some point when people stopped talking to me about certain things, then I'm like, oh wow, now I'm that guy. Now I'm in that seat. Now I have to be more mindful of because am I doing these things to people? And are they going to walk out of my office and say, like, he won't make time for me, and everything else is more important than me. He doesn't make time for his employees. And I mean, that was like one of the things I heard more than anything. And, the shipping industry is a very lean organization. They don't have a lot of fat. And so it's very high demand, high touch points on phone calls and things. And you could easily fall into that trap where it's just like, I'm too busy to make time for my people. But you really have to push yourself and say, like, okay, you're here. This is important. I'm going to make myself available. And just by doing that, you start to win respect of people and say, like, wow, this is really great because I feel like I can talk to this person as a person. Versus, like, again, they're just like, I'm never going to talk to this person because they just won't make time, or they give me more work to do, or they're not listening, and all those things that were wrong. But again, it was just, I was very fortunate that I started off in a coordinator position and just went up the ranks because, again, I'd heard all these things, and I'm like, ooh, I don't want someone to say that about me, because I want to be a good leader. I want people to, you hear this expression that, like, oh, they'd run through a wall for this person. I'd do anything for this person. These types of statements. And I wanted to be that kind of leader. And it's like, well, how do I do those things? Well, I do it by having a good availability and a communication standard with others.
And I love that we all have these molds, these reference points for both good leadership and bad leadership in our heads. You referred to this in when you were talking about the fact that you actually learned from the bad leaders that you've had. So in the spirit of having some fun, I wanted to ask you, can you tell us about the worst leader that you've ever had?
Wow. The worst leader I ever had. That's a tough one, because I think there's some characteristics of leaders that are up there. And among those are when somebody is just like, doesn't want to be questioned, right? That you can't, like, I think at my current company, we have this culture, we call it debate, decide, unite, that you can ask anyone anything and you should be able to defend yourself. And I always appreciated that, because if you don't like something I'm saying, then let's talk about it and let me understand that. And I should be able to defend myself. and speak to why I'm saying what I'm saying or what I'm doing. And if I can't, then there's probably something flawed in that. But there's some leaders who are like, oh, no, 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 you don't understand. I'm a vice president and you have to do what I tell you. Like you're pulling rank. And I mean, I'm trying to think of like what's worse than that. That was always frustrating for me where it's like, no, I'm the boss, obey. Um, or, there's this expression that people would say, like the emperor has no clothes, which means that like what they're doing isn't real, but nobody wants to tell them, no one can
Mm.
like say that. And it's those kinds of things where I think once you become disconnected with people and you just say, do as I say, and what's even worse is do as I say and not as I do. Those types of things as a leader are really like horrible for your people. And, you shouldn't be surprised when people won't necessarily rally around somebody or do like those extra things or like, hey, you need help right now. I'm going to make this happen. They're instead going to be very task oriented and say like, yeah, just tell me what to do because you're going to tell me anyway. There's really no benefit in me being creative or trying to help solve this problem because, again, it's this top-down mentality. And leaders I've seen like that, I think it's just you get a disengaged workforce and
Mm.
you're probably losing some of those benefits you could get where if you had the engagement that you would see a lot more production and efficiency.
And that's a great way of putting it, that you have to stand by your words. You have to be the person who's not just saying all those fancy things, but actually someone who people can look at and say, no, actually this person, they actually follow through on it. They actually, preach, they actually practice what they preach. They actually know what they're talking about. It really gets my profession, I think, sometimes a bad rap because I help a lot of these leaders speak better. I help
Mm-hmm.
them, formulate the words they need to say and deliver them in the most impactful way, make sure that they're really showcasing their personality and, of course, their authority and thought leadership in different contexts. But it's up to them to come up with the right message in the first place. I used to be in PR where we actually wrote down everything that the CEO had to say in a media interview, and we would just feed them these words. And that's absolutely not what I advise now, because the more you get into the habit of saying things that you haven't even written, the more of a disconnect there's going to be between what you're saying and what you actually end up doing. But the reason why I was talking about the industry then getting a bad rap is then people still associate these talks or presentations or media interviews that these leaders give with being fake in a lot of ways.
Right.
So how do you bring about that authenticity and create that connection with whoever you're talking to while still showing that there is substance behind the words? That's, I don't know if that's something that you've thought about, because you also speak outside of your company, right? You also
Yeah.
speak as yourself, as a personal brand, and also I'm assuming also as a representative of your company.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's tricky. And I, I mean, look, I think it's hard going to be authentic if things are scripted, right? I mean, then it's
Mm.
just you're an actor at that point, and you're just saying like these are the words I'm going to play this role. I'm going to have a certain sound. I'm going to have I don't know a Staten Island accent, and I'm going to I don't know have this persona, and that's how I'm going to act. But then you're going to meet me personally, like wow, you're totally different. I mean, that's an extreme example, but I think how do you weave in those points? And to me, I think it's more plausible to say, let's try an education first. Let's talk about some of these topics, whether it's like empathy and vulnerability, which I think, like when I started in the industry, nobody was talking about vulnerability or empathy. That was like a sign of weakness. And
Mm.
like, I'm so glad to see how emotional intelligence is involved in a workplace because it's a lot more prevalent. I mean, we're talking about mental health issues now. I mean, when I started in the industry, no one was talking about mental health and these kinds of things. And
Mm-hmm.
so to me, I think when I think about this topic, I would love to think, and again, you can call me naive. It's fine. Maybe I am, but I would like to see us do more of an education and like, hey, you know what? Why don't you watch this show by Brene Brown and listen to her talk about like
Yeah.
vulnerability and like dare to lead and read her book and let's come back and let's talk after you hear what they have to say and then let's talk about messaging. I'd like to believe that's a more authentic path because now you're like educating because I think the more we're like scripting and things, and I'm glad to hear that's like getting away from that because I think the more scripting we do, we're just sort of like masking these real issues to say like, well, I'm just saying these things. I don't really believe them, but I'm just
Mm-hmm.
saying them. And that's a pity. I think people in leadership roles, I said it earlier that you have a responsibility as a leader and you have a responsibility to be thoughtful to your audience to say, if I'm sharing my vision as an example of like what we're going to do, but I'm doing it in a way where I'm alienating half my team because I'm deciding to use like jokes and sports metaphors and things, you know, that I can connect with the female part of my team. And I probably didn't. Or there might even be like turned off, like, ugh, like this guy, he's just so wrapped up in these male ideas. And, that to me is a failure. I have a responsibility. But, how do you get to that willingness? I mean, I think it's through education and awareness. I think it's through us talking about it as a leader. So I would challenge those as leaders to say, like, listen, if we really want to be effective, we should be educated and we should understand these issues and really understand why, if I'm being given the script, why am I being told to say these things? Because I think there's some coaching and developing you should do, but it really shouldn't be a script. It should be more of an education.
I love that you brought up Brené Brown and the power of vulnerability because the more we speak in public now, I feel like there is this very, very direct connection that you can draw between showing vulnerability, showing what really goes on behind the scenes, and creating that trust. And when you create that trust with the audience, that's what makes you impactful. So it's now clearer than ever that people don't want these perfect, shiny people that are putting up appearances. It's the same with celebrities. It's the same with personal brands. And it's definitely the same with leaders, CEOs, C-level execs. No one wants this larger than life, absolutely perfect person because now we are very aware. We were always aware, but somehow, I don't know, we just let it slide. But now we know that no one is perfect. So if you have someone who's actually talking to us on the same level, like we're human, and showing that, oh, things are not really perfect. This are the mistakes that I made, and this is what we're doing about it. It is 1,000 times more impactful than saying canned words that are beautifully written that show absolutely zero personality, zero vulnerability, and create zero trust.
Yeah. I mean, I think that like if you go back to like the 60s, and I wasn't born in the 60s, but my parents were around then, and I think there was a lot more of an obedient culture, that it was just more like very hierarchical. And maybe this is a hangover from, these times of royalties and things like that, that it was things were very hierarchical. But I think it's, I'm not stepping too far out of bounds to say like it was an obedient culture that you just sort of obey and there's this hierarchy there. And I think the one benefit of like having all this technology with social media and being able to express yourself is I think it's exposed that a lot of people feel the same way about a lot of things. And it's like, oh, you didn't believe that either? Oh, good, because I didn't. And now that becomes more of the norm, is that like, no, 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 that wasn't believable. It doesn't resonate with me because it's impossible. No one's that perfect. No one is living this fairy tale lifestyle. The fairy tale isn't true. And so now that it like distorts your believability, that's impactful. And now it's like, oh, wait a minute. Now you don't even, it creates distrust. Like you don't think I'm an authentic person. So, I think that's one thing that's just evolved over time, but certainly today, there's a lot less tolerance for this like fakeness that it's
Oh,
like,
yeah.
oh, this is too good to be true, and I'm going to call it out. And I think that's very healthy. But I think people need to recognize that and say, like, okay, again, part of this being an authentic person is being able to be vulnerable and demonstrate some level of empathy. I think that messaging is getting out there more, and I'm excited to see things change in that direction.
It requires being bold on the part of the leader who is used to putting up a very specific front, especially with their team, if they're within their company, if they're used to that very specific model of leadership where they have to, be the one who's presenting themselves a certain way, wearing a suit and tie and being very either structured and formal or at least very polished. It really presents a challenge to them if they're looking to be more public and outward facing. And if they carry that same persona over, they're really not going to be resonating with the people that they're speaking with. So I think it's a mental challenge, I think, that they have to really overcome. One of the things that I really love about this president, well, my president, because I became French last year, so the French president, Emmanuel Macron, he is really trying, you can see, to appeal to all kinds of demographics, specifically Gen Z. So he does a lot of YouTube and social media stuff, more than I've seen other presidents do. And he had this whole campaign where he wanted YouTubers to create awareness about the vaccine and about the COVID vaccine. And he had this competition going about whoever creates the best video that gets the most views gets an interview with the president. And that definitely happened. He went on this YouTube show with these two YouTubers and he was like, I'm here. We can talk about anything. And it wasn't a political interview. It was like, I forgot the name of the game that they played, but it was like, I think it was like Two Truths and a Lie. So they're
Oh,
just
okay.
sitting there playing Two Truths and a Lie with the president of the country. And as I was watching that, I was like, even 7 or 8 years ago, I couldn't have imagined this happening with the president of a country. Just him doing things like that. I know I don't go into his politics, but just someone who is the figurehead of a whole country doing something like that is really indicative of the times.
Yeah, and I love that story because it makes the president seem human, before they seem
Yeah.
like they're another level and untouchable, like I can't relate to this person. And to be like, I mean, we're all humans at the end of the day, right? So, I mean,
Yeah.
I think it's very refreshing to have those reminders where someone's acting in a way that feels relatable and it's like, oh, I played that game too. And I think having that connection, I mean, connection to people is really super important. And it's really cool to see that because I think it's just a demonstration of like how thinking is changing and I want to connect with people. And I hope people can kind of learn from that and think of like, wow, don't focus on like creating the YouTube video and that's how you get the most views. Focus on how do I connect with the people I'm trying to connect to, right? And like, what am I after? Is there a segment I'm not connecting with? And I think the step one is asking for feedback. I mean, I think that's like when you talk about vulnerability, some people don't want feedback because it's like, oh, I don't want to know what people think. But I think if you can ask for feedback and say like, hey, what did you think? Did it like, no, it didn't feel like for this or that reason. Well, then you can
Mm-hmm.
identify that this may be a problem spot. Maybe I need to focus on that as I evolve as a leader so that the next time I'm presented in this scenario, I can connect with those people that might not have felt that before.
That's a great point. Do you have people around you, perhaps mentors or people that you look up to, people whose opinions you respect, who will always give you direct, honest feedback?
So, this is a funny topic because I've gone out of my way to get feedback. And this really stems from, we have this women in shipping group at my company. And we've talked about how it's a male dominated industry. And we've talked a few times about like what I need to do as a male leader, and I feel like I've been asking for feedback, but was I asking the women in my office for feedback? Did I specifically do that? Did I ask more than one person, or did I just
Mm.
ask who is around me, who might be my friends, who might be male? And so, it's taken some effort, but now I have some good groups on a peer level, but also in different levels of the organization that I want to get their feedback and say like, hey, what did you think of that town hall? Like, was it great? And sometimes they said, what stuck out to me is that women were noticeably absent from presenting. And I'm like, you know what? You're 100% right. That's a big miss. We have to fix that. Like, if you don't feel like, because then what it says is like, well, these leadership roles are unattainable for women. And that's not true, but it feels that way. So I think it's again, as a leader, you just have to be willing to ask for feedback on different levels of the organization. And the peers, if they were presenting, they'll maybe like high fiving and thinking that was great. But is that what your audience felt like? And you really need to ask them, because if it's not, then it might have been a miss and you might be able to do a better job the next time.
Intentional inclusion is definitely something that needs to be done more. I'm glad that now, DEI is a thing. It wasn't 10 years ago. People weren't making an intentional effort to include more women. And just like you said, simply ask the question, where are the women? If that question
Right.
just gets asked in more rooms around the world, everything would look very, very different. We've all, yeah.
I just want to make a point there though, because I think what the part I reflected on is like, you know what? I shouldn't have needed to ask the audience for that. We should have said it to ourselves. And that's where it's like, we have to do a better job. Like next time, before we even like have a town hall, let's make sure that we're being able to do this, including women in our presentation versus like letting it get to the audience and me having to ask somebody. But I think that's really learning and evolution there when it's like, oh yeah, you told me, I reacted to it. I didn't need you to tell me again.
And earlier you mentioned something about sports analogies and how you became aware of speaking a certain way that you had been used to speaking in, but then becoming aware that, oh, perhaps the words that I'm using, the vocabulary, the examples, the analogies might be very catered to a male audience. Are there changes that you made in the way that you spoke, in the way that you speak now? Are you now aware of the environment and the audience, and how do you actually, in a practical sense, try to be more inclusive when you speak?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I do enjoy a metaphor as much as anybody else. And I think it helps visualize to your audience point you're trying to convey, and you're trying to create some relatability, say, when you do this. And to me, it's more about like, okay, if I use the expression Monday morning quarterback, what do I really mean? Well, what I really mean is that it's a lot easier for me to lead something with the benefit of hindsight, and I can talk about it the next day and like have all this expertise. Okay, that's what I meant. Are there different examples, or there are different ways I can convey this? And I might just want to say, you know what, everyone's an expert with the benefit of hindsight. And that is something that feels like more relatable, because if I just say Monday morning quarterback, not everybody knows what that means. And you know what? When I was a young kid, I didn't know what that meant either. I had to like figure it out, like, oh, I see what you mean. But the point is, there's a way to express it. I think you just have to be thoughtful and say like, okay, everybody, let's kill the sports analogies. Okay. If you're watching a football game, fine, use your sports analogies. And when you're in leadership, environments, let's skip the sports analogies and let's just do the work to say, this is what we're trying to say. And let's express it in a way that everyone can understand, versus somebody who says, well, this is a little inside baseball, but I'm going to share this with you. And they're like, I don't know what they're going to say next. I've no idea where that's going. And instead of saying like, okay, this is like an insider secret, I'm going to share this with you, that you might like, oh, okay, that's much easier to consume. And I think really, if you want to be an effective communicator, you should really be thinking about, wow, there's people I'm not including because of the way I'm speaking.
And the more that you move to bigger roles, bigger stages, bigger audiences, more multicultural audiences, the more you have to be aware of words that you're saying that might have a very specific significance to only a group of people. So when I moved to China, for example, I couldn't talk the way that I was talking back in the US or back in Pakistan. I had to make things simpler. I had to make sure that I even spoke a little bit slower and enunciated more than I would normally so that I would be understood. And like you said, that is the point of all of this, to be clear, to be understood, to be relatable. And you can't achieve that if you're in your head and you're not adjusting at all to the audience, to the environment, and the manner that you're speaking. And before we go, I would love to talk a little bit more about your speaking, your public speaking. Tell me a little about the times that you've spoken in public over the years and how that has shaped the way that you speak.
Well, I mean, I think, first of all, public speaking didn't come naturally to me. Like I didn't really want to do that. But as like things evolved in my life, it became clear to me that that was like part of it, and your ability to speak, was important and a great way to get a message out there. And there were a few different occasions where I was fortunate enough to be involved in a few projects and work groups. And at first I was more of a listener, and then later in life I became the presenter. And there were a lot of takeaways that I came as a listener versus when I was a presenter. I just there were some things that really started to click. And to be honest, what made the most impression on me were the things I didn't like. So, for example, people that weren't engaging when they were public speaking, that they weren't trying to pull in the audience in terms of like having a discussion or having a thought or asking for validation. Are you asking people to like show some sign that they understand what they're saying? Or is it just, death by PowerPoint? I'm just like click, click, click. And I'm presenting in a way like you don't care if I'm like taking anything away. And I can remember there were people that were speaking, and I would sit there and I would look around the room and I would say to myself, now what do I think anyone remembered from what they said? Like what are they, what was the takeaway here? And you know what? It was like the next day it was forgettable. I'm like, hey, do you remember that presentation? Like what stuck out to you? They're like, it was long. Like, there was no interaction. Like it was nothing to do with the content. It was more about the experience. And so these kinds of things were important to me of like, okay, how do I create something that's engaging? Well, I'm going to ask questions, and maybe it's like not even a question that you're going to answer. It might be a bit of a rhetorical question, but it's going to get you thinking to create that engagement with my audience so that it's establishing this relatability. Because again, like some of the feedback I was getting from people was like, how awful is it that you have to listen to someone talk for half an hour and you take away nothing except I was bored. I couldn't connect. Like there's too much material. It's very long. Like all these things are really negative. So again, there were a lot of things in my life that, I drew from, but first as an audience member, then, checking in with other people. And then as a presenter, like, what can I do? Am I avoiding these things? And I was sensitive to those things. Like, okay, I have a lot of slides. I'm not going to read them to you. I'm just going to touch on them. I'll send you the deck. You can read it yourself. But there's like 2 points I want to take away from this slide. And so they're just things I've done over time that I've learned from. And that doesn't mean I've got it all figured out. There are thousands of ways I can improve, but I think it's just that consistency to ask for feedback and see what people think about what you're presenting. And maybe, you know what, it was awesome, but did you ask anybody if they felt like it was awesome? And what did they say about it? And that really is the point of validation. Like, who cares what I think? It matters what you think, because you're the audience. I'm trying to share something with you. And are you picking up on that or not?
I love this because it's exactly what I tell people, that you are not there to deliver the PowerPoint. Your PowerPoint can be an email. If all you're there is to just click through the next slide and just tell us what's on the slide, you're there to deliver your message. And you have to use whatever tools you can to do that. And I love that you talked about the fact that people remember what they felt. It's like the Maya Angelou quote, right? People will forget what you say, people will forget what you did, but they will remember how you made them feel. And it's actually really important to know that invoking these feelings in people is not just a fluff exercise. It's not just something you do to be nice. You invoke these feelings while you're speaking so that the feelings then become a vehicle for them to remember your message, because they will remember if they felt something. If they felt nothing, like you said, they're going to forget, or they're going to remember the feeling of being incredibly bored and wasting an hour or half an hour of their time.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think some people try and do too much. They're just like, okay, I can put all my thoughts into a deck. I can put it up in front of everyone and they're just going to consume it and remember it. And it's like, listen, it would be nice, but you just can't download it on people. You have to be thoughtful. And I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned there.
Yes. Yeah. Maybe one day when we're all living in the Matrix.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
Well, thank you so much, Don. Thank you for sharing all your insights, your incredible journey, and just the way that you think about life and leadership. I really enjoyed listening to that. Thank you so much.
Yeah, great. It was a lot of fun to be on the show. I really appreciate being able to share, and I had a great time. So thanks for having me on.
Thank you. Would you like to tell our audience where they can find you if they want to contact you, if they want to get in touch?
Sure. I mean, the easiest way is through email. You can reach me at donald.davis@NYSHEX.com. Or you can find me on LinkedIn, Donald Davis. I work at NYSHEX. Should be able to find me pretty easily. And yeah, you can DM me if you want to contact me or send me an email, whatever works. I'm around.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Don. It was just such a pleasure having you on the Speak as a Leader podcast. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. I really enjoyed it.